The Hate You Give spent 50 weeks at the top of the New York Times bestseller list. But if you walk into certain libraries or schools across the country, you won't find it on the shelves. You'll find it behind caution tape. Critics often try to pull the novel by citing its profanity or depictions of violence. The actual friction comes from its refusal to offer an easy, post-racial resolution. It forces audiences to look directly at the realities of systemic racism and police brutality without the safety net of a comfortable ending. To understand how Angie Thomas built that narrative tension, we have to go back to 2009. At the time, she was a college student living a completely divided life. She was constantly code-switching, altering her speech, behavior, and presentation depending on exactly where she was standing. On one side, she had her home in a poor, predominantly Black neighborhood. On the other, she had her university, a wealthy, predominantly white, Gothic-style campus, where she felt pressure to be a quiet, palatable version of herself. Navigating these two Americas requires an exhausting amount of psychological friction. That daily pressure of balancing dual identities became the exact foundation Thomas needed to find her voice, and eventually to build her protagonist, Starr Carter. That year, a white police officer shot and killed Oscar Grant, an unarmed 22-year-old Black man in Oakland, California. Thomas was devastated by the news, but when she returned to her college campus, she listened as her classmates actively tried to justify his death, digging into his past to rationalize the violence. She was suddenly staring at a massive empathy gap. The people in her collegiate world couldn't see the humanity of the people in her homeworld. That gap became the specific problem she needed to solve. She decided to write a short story for her senior project that humanized the headlines. She chose to approach the narrative, in her own words, not just in anger, but with love. The story functioned as a personal release for her frustration. Once the senior project was finished, she shelved the draft and moved on, leaving the manuscript untouched for years. A few years later, a grimly familiar cycle repeated itself. The high-profile killings of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and Sandra Bland sparked nationwide protests and ignited the Black Lives Matter movement. Watching this returning wave of national trauma unfold, Thomas realized the empathy gap hadn't closed. Her college project needed to be dusted off and expanded into a full-length novel. To structure the complex narrative, she found a philosophical framework in an unexpected place: the words of late rapper and activist Tupac Shakur. This flowchart illustrates the acronym Tupac had tattooed across his abdomen: Thug Life. He explained that it stood for "The hate you give little infants fucks everybody." It outlines a direct cycle of marginalization. When a society institutionalizes poverty, neglect, and violence against children, that anger eventually loops back to damage the entire community. That specific breakdown gave Thomas the exact title for her book, The Hate You Give, and the courage to make her narrative entirely unapologetic. By adopting Tupac's philosophy, she was able to take her raw, personal grief and forge it into a highly structured critique of cyclical, systemic violence. Having a philosophy isn't the same as executing a manuscript. Thomas knew she couldn't rely on raw emotion alone. The story demanded rigorous, airtight authenticity. She dove into heavy legal and media research. She interviewed attorneys, read through dense court transcripts, and dissected hours of news footage to ensure the interactions with law enforcement in her novel held up to strict real-world scrutiny. Over a 6-month period, she wrote her first draft, using her mother as her primary sounding board. Her main objective was building deeply three-dimensional characters to shatter the flat stereotypes so often broadcast on the evening news. When it was time to find a publisher, she took an unconventional route. Unsure if the industry was ready for a Black Lives Matter-inspired young adult novel, she pitched the concept directly to a literary agent on Twitter, which eventually sparked a massive 13-house bidding war. By the time the bidding war ended, her combination of rigorous research and lived experience had secured her a 2-book deal and a film option before the novel even hit shelves. The book quickly climbed the banned list, challenged by critics labeling it anti-police.
Thomas defended it as a critique of systemic police violence. To highlight this complexity, she made the protagonist's uncle a police officer, working within the very system it interrogates. Ultimately, Thomas wasn't writing to explain systemic racism to a white audience. She wrote the book to serve as a mirror for young Black girls. That mirror serves a highly specific, empowering function. It validates their lived experiences, shows them they aren't isolated in their trauma, and explicitly grants them permission to be angry about the systems they navigate every day. Thomas found that her impact came from focusing inward. By writing the specific, authentic story she needed to read for herself, she created a narrative that resonated with millions.